Welcome to this flight of the Retail Pilot. I'm Ken Pilot, former CEO and current brand advisor, investor, and board member. I'm thrilled to share with you some of the insights from retail's leaders and legends, as well as my perspective on retail today. This podcast is sponsored by the following. Want to drive more traffic and conversions on your e-commerce site? Brands that use video see 41% more traffic from search engines. And that's just the start. Meet Firework, the leader in AI-powered video commerce. Trusted by brands like L'Oreal and Unilever, Firework turns any page into an immersive, shoppable experience. From pre-recorded long-form content to short-form and everything in between. With Firework, you can easily integrate social media videos into your product pages and run pre-recorded digital showrooms with shoppable content. Plus, Firework offers AI-powered virtual assistants to personalize shopper experience and drive higher conversion. That's why I'm an investor and advisor. Learn more at firework.com. Welcome back to the Retail Pilot. On today's flight of the Retail Pilot, I am thrilled to have Gene Pressman, a third-generation member of the family that founded the iconic Barneys New York, a groundbreaking specialty store that transformed American retail and fashion. Grandson of Barney Pressman, who opened the original shop in 1923, Gene played a pivotal role as co-CEO, creative director, and head of merchandising and marketing. Alongside his father, Fred, he elevated Barney's from a discount menswear store to a global fashion powerhouse, introducing audiences to visionary designers like Giorgio Armani, Comme des Garçons, and Dries Van Noten. Known for his rebellious spirit and sharp fashion intuition, Gene infused Barneys with culture, creativity, and risk-taking, making it a New York institution. His memoir, They All Came to Barneys, is a candid, vibrant account of the store's rise, challenges, and lasting legacy, capturing an era of irreverent style and retail innovation that shaped modern fashion. Gene, welcome to the Retail Pilot.
I couldn't have said it any better.
So great to have you and good to see you again, my friend.
You too, Ken.
Let's kick this off. I've read the book. I loved it. It brought back many memories for me, though you're a couple of years older. I did really relish some of those experiences because in a few cases, I had touched on some of them myself. But looking back at the early days, you grew up around Barneys. But what's your first personal memory of the store, and how did it shape your ambitions?
Well, my mother used to drag me down to the store on 17th Street and pick out clothes for me for my prep school or whatever I was wearing at the moment. And basically, I hated the experience. But I was proud at the same time of Barneys. I knew that my father and my grandfather had built something very successful. It's when you got in a taxi and you just said, we want to take us to Barneys, and they knew exactly where to go. That was pretty cool. But except peripherally, I didn't really care that much. I wasn't into that. I was into my guitar and, other extracurricular activity. I mean, at a very young age, obviously, into sports and whatever, not too much into books, meaning school books. But as Barney started to evolve and my father got more and more into it, he started to change Barney's. He started to upgrade the image. He started to upgrade the advertising. He started bringing more interesting product, especially from Europe. And, then when I started going down there in the 60s, they had a shop called the Billy Baxter shop, which I think was like any store's first entree into like the cool sort of London scene at the time, And I thought that was pretty cool. They started to buy things that I actually liked. In fact, I remember that I bought this Nehru suit And when I wore it to my prep school, which was Hackley, I caught so much abuse, you couldn't believe it. I mean, the kids were teasing me and all that. And I didn't really care. And I wasn't even sure whether I liked it or not. But it was definitely different than, the very preppy kind of looks that they were wearing. But that's generally my first impressions. My father was very clever and that he never pushed it on me. He let me find my own way. I mean, every night at the dinner table, that's all he would talk about because he was so passionate about it. And, we politely listened, but I'm sure we were daydreaming about other stuff. He probably didn't care. And by the time I got to college, I had no clue what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to go to Vietnam. So, that was to go to college, you had a deferment for 4 years. So I went, it took me a few tries. And then I ended up in the Newhouse School and I studied motion picture, which I really loved. I like visual things and I like theater. And at that period of time, some of the greatest movie making ever existed from, say, 67 to 73, because people took so many risks. And the studios backed them in those days, and they were just pumping out just insane films. It was amazing to see.
You mentioned the book, really the impact of Fred on Barneys. I mean, he was the one under his leadership. He transformed Barneys from what was an off-price value suit store to a leader in fashion. Was there a pivotal moment where you identified what was needed to make that transformation even greater?
Yeah. Let me just back up for 1 second on this. What was so unusual about my father, and probably the important creatives of that time, is they were both left and right brain. He was as creative in business as he was in terms of his sensibilities, his eye, his appreciation for beauty. So that combination just took Barneys to another planet. And as I said in the book, I was relatively new at Barneys. I think it was in 73 or 74. He was thumbing through at his house on a Sunday rainy day. We were watching the Knicks playoff game when they were actually good, although they're getting good now. And he was reading Romo Vogues, which were, so huge in those days. You'd get a hernia lifting them.
It was like
And
the RH catalog of the day.
yeah, except, well, we won't go there. And he was thumbing through. And what was ironic was at that point, things were starting to change a little bit in the fact that before that, designers were in the back rooms, the door was locked, and they weren't allowed to come out because the people that were in the forefront were the manufacturers. And so they didn't do the designing, obviously. They might have enhanced it, but you had these brilliant designers, but they didn't get any of the glamour. And he's looking through and he sees these design different items, coat, a raincoat, a shirt, a leather thing, shoes, whatever. And he's noticing it's many different manufacturers, but they're all designed by one person. And he starts saying to me, "What do you think of this? This looks so amazing." And I had no clue.
And not only did you have no clue, Gene, but you were not interested because he was interrupting the Knick game.
Exactly. And although he was watching it too, because he loves sports. And, but it was my dad, so I had to be respectful. And this went on for like an hour. And it would be an interlude of interruptions every 20 minutes. So finally, he says to me, I think I'm going to try and contact this guy and go to Italy and see if I can sign him to like a 10-year exclusive deal. And I said, yeah, Dad, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. And then things progressed very fast, and he did. And, the designer's name, of course, was Giorgio Armani. And Giorgio Armani didn't just change Barneys, but he changed the world of men's fashion. It completely went to another level. And of course, being Barneys, helped his career tremendously. So it was a wonderful marriage. And menswear in those days was locked into really being sort of like these very classic uniforms, Brooks Brothers. In those days, guys that were in the workforce weren't allowed to wear anything but super classic natural shoulder kind of suits. And they had like 50 of the same color, and that was it. And that's the way they wanted it. When Armani came in, he completely changed everything. He made it slouchy and, much smaller little shoulder pads and much more fitted in a sense. And everything was different. And only the real creative types got it. I wanted to expand that. So I went to Europe and started to bring back men's sportswear, men's designer, and also clothing that these designers had made, which again were more relaxed and had a whole different attitude. And then I was hooked because I started in Barneys in 1972. My film career was very short. As I said in the book, there were a lot of unemployed 21-year-old film directors. So I have no patience. So I said, I'm out of here, and went back to New York. I have no clue what I was going to do. I got an offer from a guy who was a little older than me. His name was Barney Pressman. And he said, why don't you move in with me? It took me about 1 second to say yes, because he lived in this palace on 67th and Park and stayed there 6 months. I went to the warehouse to work, and he went up to the C-suite, if you will. And I wanted to do that because, look, being the boss's son didn't suck, but I wanted to do it on my own, and I wanted to learn from the bottom up. And no one told me to do it, just like no one told me to go to Barneys, except my grandfather did, because my father would never do that. And, one thing went from there. And then once I got into buying, I got hooked, addicted. I said, I love this job. They're paying me to see all these beautiful things, super high quality, and then bring them back and sell them, and then obviously to see customers really appreciate that and love it, and to see all those great Barneys bags, around town, especially in our competitors' shops, really got me crazy. So it was pretty cool.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. Looking for a 3PL that's truly next level? Cart.com is a 3PL on steroids with nationwide distribution centers and the most advanced AI-driven software solutions from WMS and OMS to TMS, all designed to streamline your entire delivery process. With Cart.com, you get a fully integrated commerce platform that unifies your operations, data, and customer experience all in one place. Their platform combines physical distribution with cutting-edge AI, empowering retailers to scale faster and more efficiently. Whether you're D2C, B2B, or omni-channel, Cart.com connects your tech stack, simplifies your logistics, and powers your growth. From click to customer, enabling distribution for Janie and Jack, Portland Leather Goods, Tom's, and many more. Cart.com. Today's podcast is also brought to you by Simulate. Search has changed. Today's shoppers don't type keywords, they ask questions, full sentences, 35 words on average. Legacy search engines can't keep up, but Simulate can. Simulate's the first AI-native commerce platform powered by Commerce GPT, built to understand intent, not just match words. That means smarter results, fewer dead ends, and higher conversions automatically. Visit Simulate AI. That's with a C, simulate with a C, to see how context-aware AI is reshaping commerce in-store and online. And we're back with Gene. So you've done a lot already, from getting into the business, really bringing sportswear into Barneys, to launching a label. But there was one thing I know in your mind that was missing, because you had Bloomingdale's Envy, the impact of Fiorucci, and seeing what was happening in that store. The big thing that was missing from Barneys was women's. And I think it was really in your mind's eye and your vision that said, we need to bring her here and have that buzz and that energy. Just tell me about that, and tell me about the negotiation you probably had to have with your dad. You built the best men's store, arguably, in the country.
So, everything is about timing and natural progression. And when my father changed the men's to, we were already the largest men's store in the world. But when he changed it and brought in mostly European fashion, that was the next natural progression. And then going from there and bringing in sportswear and making it a little more relaxed and casual, that followed that. And then the obvious thing was to go into women's, because men's sportswear sort of is like women's, it's more of a woman's mentality in that sense. I want to interject one thing, though. There was another texture at Barneys that was equally important, and that's my mother's Chelsea Passage, because she started doing that in the early 70s to mid 70s. And so she brought in sort of gifts for the home and home goods, and that added another texture. And it also brought in a lot more women to the store. And it's funny because she put it in between the men's designer and the raincoat department. So that it was like sort of airdropped in there, but it worked. And there were already, for years and years and years, a ton of women coming into the store, because men hated to shop. They always, they brought their girlfriends or their wives in, and basically the women picked everything out for them. So we had a huge audience already, and it was a natural. And also the savvy women would go downstairs to the boys department and buy things, because they were in small sizes, for themselves. And also they were way less expensive than, what would be women's ready to wear. So I lived up on the Upper East Side in what was called Bloomingdale's country. And Bloomingdale's was the center of the universe in those days. In fact, downtown didn't even exist, which is hard to believe. I mean, the only thing of any consequence that was there was Barneys. Chelsea was basically a wasteland. Soho didn't exist. Tribeca didn't exist. The West Village, yeah, there were people who lived there, but it was a very bohemian kind. It wasn't family, really. And then the East Village, was populated by $250 apartments for artists and all the rats you could chase. So it was uptown, and it was this enclave of about 6 square blocks. It went from First Avenue, starting at like 59th Street, up to like 62nd or 63rd Street, over to Lexington Avenue, and and right in the middle of it was Bloomingdale's. And Bloomingdale's was really pretty cool in those days. Marvin Trout was a brilliant merchant, and he had great merchants there. And they brought a lot of European merchandise over to America. And it was, they were kind of fast fashion in a sense. And there was a lot of action. I mean, we'd go there on Saturdays, and, it was crazy. It was like one huge club. And I'd go in there and I'd look at the merchandise, and I'd get angry because they had a lot of cool things that Barneys didn't have. And that used to piss me off. So, and then I would also go over to Bendel's because in those days, in my opinion, Henry Bendel was the best women's store. Sort of like Barney's in a sense, but smaller, but very specialized. Had a very exclusive kind of point of view that was led by Jerry Stutz at the time, and she was a great merchant. And they also had introduced a lot of women's designers. And I had a friend there who was a buyer named Marion Greenberg, and we're still friends. And she was very kind to me because I would ask her, I'm sure, all these annoying questions about what's this designer, what's that designer, because now it was in the air that I'm thinking about, I got to go to Europe and buy some women's. And she took me around and showed me a lot of things. I'm sure if Jerry had known about it, Marion would probably be working for me then. So I took my buddy Michael, who was the men's buyer at the time, and I said, we're going to Europe. And we went to Europe, to Paris. We had no budget, no open to buy, and no clue. And we just went there. And the big show in those days, they didn't have a lot of showrooms, designer showrooms. You just went to this one huge mega show out near the airport. And it was like 3 days. And I was like mesmerized. I never saw so many incredible, designer merchandise. And I went nuts. Just started buying everything. By the third day, I felt like I was on roller skates because the vendors were starting to close up their stands and I wasn't finished yet, and I'm buying and I'm buying and I'm buying. And anyway, that was in late 75. And then it came in 76 and we put it next to the men's sportswear because I had no idea where to put it. And then I realized I bought so much that I didn't know where I was going to put it. So we started moving other things out. And women started coming in and they really loved it. And there were some designers that no one ever heard of before. I just bought what I liked. And then I realized that I didn't go to Italy. I said, how did I forget to do that? So the next season, I went to Italy. You can see everything's organic, which is something that's missing today. You know what I mean? I think you need to be more organized than that, but there has to be somewhere in between. And I went to Italy and, we already carried Armani, obviously, then, women's. And I found Gianfranco Ferré. I was his first client. And what was interesting is Barney's men's was known very well then. And they were excited that I was buying women's because they thought it would be a natural that Barney should definitely carry women's. And the one fear that I had was I didn't want to be like Brooks Brothers or Paul Stewart with the way they approach women's. It was kind of like men's for women. It was very suity and very go to work. And the only way that I could get out from the shadow of Barney's men's was to do really high fashion women's and do women's as women's, not do women's as men's. So that was my approach. And needless to say, before I left Barney's in 98, women's was 80% of the total volume of Barney's.
And part of the ride that you talked about, I think your dad recognized the potential. You added Peter Marino to the mix to build out the duplex, still down on 17th Street, which then expanded to your own women's store on 17th Street. And it really, from there, it was, as you said, somewhere in the book, you were all diesel fuel with no brakes, but it sounds like so was the women's business.
Yeah, it took off and it created a totally different dynamic.
Up until this point, the business is rolling. You guys are hitting on all cylinders. You have the idea to go out and raise money to accelerate future growth. And you do. You raise $12 million plus guarantees from Isetan department store in Japan. That's basically going to finance the future. Sounded like a good deal. They were going to pay for the build out. You were going to pay them rent. And off you went. And at one point, you were actually planning 3 flagship stores without having any of them yet open. So this is about 91, I believe, as you're barreling into the future, unstoppable. What this is really brings in the next chapter here and what happens next. And not easy to
Yeah.
summarize because it's a lot, but it really was probably the turning point where you had this amazing store, this amazing formula, and it's all working. And now you decide, let's fast forward and take it out, both in terms of flagships and also mall stores at Barneys
Right.
America.
So we were very lucky. We got the most extraordinary partner, Isitan, which was run by a fourth generation family. So already there was tremendous synergy between the Kasugis and the Pressmans because we were third generation, they were fourth generation, and it was like one huge love fest. The second thing was that America, it was in 89 when we did the deal. And America, the 80s was a crazy period of overspending, not on our part, but, the customer, because Wall Street was roaring and the brokers were buying, as I said, like, you know, 10, 12, 20 Armani suits at a time. They didn't care. And it was insane. America started to slide in a very, very deep recession. But conversely, Japan was just going gangbusters. And if you recall, that's when they were like buying up all these American icons, Pebble Beach, Rockefeller Center, Barneys, and they were spending insanely, buying at extraordinary prices. We had a partner that didn't say no. And it's hard. I'm not making excuses, but when a partner is giving you that freedom, especially in a time where it's slow, you have to take the opportunity. Who wouldn't, right? On the other hand, there was less risk taking than you think. And it wasn't talked about. But when we started opening these smaller stores called Barneys America, first of all, I don't like malls. So Barneys, I should reword that. Barneys wasn't the right place for a mall. Okay. I like a mall today because I don't like to shop. So if I go in, I can buy a lot of things in 2 minutes. But it didn't belong in a mall or very few malls. And so I was worried that how big do we want these Barneys stores to be? Because obviously, the greater the risk if they're too big. And again, we were caught between a rock and a hard place because if we made them too small, what statement were we making? Do I not even buy men's suits and just have men's sportswear? Do I buy the breadth and width I had in women's, or do I just buy more co-op, if you will, the contemporary? Do I carry shoes? Do I carry cosmetics? Do I carry Chelsea? It was a tough decision, and it didn't make me feel great. But we made such amazing deals with the mall owners because they wanted Barneys badly in their mall. So we started expanding. And most of the stores were like 6,000 feet, something like that, 8,000 feet. And we did the best we could in terms of what we presented, and the customers liked it. We tried to stay in markets for the most part that they would understand because, let's face it, Barneys, especially in women's, was very avant-garde. So we had to be careful about that. And it turned out that in that first series of Barneys America stores, I don't remember how many, there were 8 or 10 or whatever, that I would say like 9 out of 10 of them were profitable, but it didn't really turn me on. I always wanted to be uptown. And I wanted to be uptown where all the customers and the money was. And I wanted to be within one block of all our competition. That's how I roll. So that was my dream. I know my father had always envisioned that. And we got lucky. We found a 240,000 square foot space on 61st and Madison. I mean, that when you think about it, that's almost impossible. And we asked the Japanese if they would finance it, and they said yes. So, what do I say? No, I decided I don't want to do it. So I was, ecstatic. And in fact, the deal was so crazy that they put up all the money for the real estate. They bought the whole building, which is 500 plus thousand feet, and they gave us 50% of the real estate for free. And when they did the original deal with us, they gave us $12 million for the license for Asia, the Barneys name for Asia, but they took no equity in Barneys. And they gave us, very little. I think there was an exchange of very little basically between Barneys Japan and Barneys America. But it was more about them wanting to open stores in Asia. And of course, I love that idea. And I thought they would do fantastic. So one thing led to another. And Peter Marino, who did our women's store and did the other things within Barneys, started to design this big store on Madison Avenue. In the Pressman tradition, it was supposed to open, I think, in 92 and ended up opening a year later in 93. There were a lot of delays. Just like when we opened the women's store, that opened up a year and a half later than it should have. These were ambitious projects, no doubt. And to merchandise for a store like that, when we've been downtown for years and years and years, since 1923, was a bit scary because it wasn't just the numbers, but it was, what are we going to buy uptown? Because we want to be true to Barneys and buy cool stuff, but they're a little more conservative than downtown, There wasn't the same fear in meds. So it was a big undertaking. And then all of a sudden, because that wasn't enough, we found a space in LA, an incredible space on the Golden Triangle. We were right on Wilshire Boulevard, right where it intersects Rodeo Drive. And how could we not want to do that? And so now we're building 100,000+ square foot store in LA. And then the Japanese wanted us to build a big store in Shinjuku, which is where Isetan was in Japan. So now we're building all 3 stores. But the thing I felt good about is that they were big stores and they could represent Barneys in the right way. And, I talk about the store wars, not too much in LA. You had Neiman's and Saks pressuring a little bit, but that wasn't their home field. Texas was Neiman's home field, and of course, New York was Saks's. But in terms of New York, there was a lot of pushback now from other major retailers because up until this point, they were taking us seriously, but not that seriously because we were downtown. And as long as we stayed downtown and behaved ourselves, and didn't go into where their hood was, they didn't care. But now they cared a lot. Well, the bad news for them was that a lot of this merchandise that we carried, they didn't even carry. I remember women's wear asking me, because they'd always call and they try and stir things up. Women's wear in those days, John Fairchild was brilliant at what he did. And he had great investigative reporters. And they always, when they called you, they were up to no good, right? So this reporter called me, I think in 1990, when we announced we were going uptown. And she said, well, who are you going to carry? Because we hear that a lot of designers are not going to sell you. They're already stirring the pot, right? And I said, well, that's not true, actually. She goes, well, Chanel's not selling you and Ralph's not selling you. I said, well, in the case of Chanel, they're selling us the shoes, but yes, we're not getting the clothing and the handbag. We carried them downtown. And I said, yeah, I would have liked to have had them, but I guess, they've been selling several doors uptown. I was trying to be very diplomatic here. And, and that's the way it is. And Ralph, as far as Ralph's concerned, we're opening a very big purple shop in men's for him that's going to be exclusive to us. But yes, we're not carrying the women's. But the truth about that was I never really wanted to carry Ralph and women's, at least not till later, because it really wasn't that Barneys. You know what I mean? It was very classic. And Bloomingdale's had a huge business with them, and that's cool. So, and Ralph had a huge store, right, on 72nd Street. So she says to me, well, who are you going to carry? And I said, well, we have designers that we've been doing business for a long time that we're doing very well. And she goes, who? I go, well, Azadine Alaya, Jill Sonder, Prada, Dries Van Noten, Comme des Garçons, Yogi, Helmet, and blah, blah, blah. I went on for like 10 minutes. And she says to me, who? This reporter didn't know who these people were. That was my reaction too. So, needless to say is that all of a sudden, every one of those designers were getting knocks on their door from the competition uptown. But we kept, I would say, 80% of our exclusives. And the other thing that we did that no store in women's did is we did a lot of Barney's women's private label. And we had almost 50% our own merchandise. And between the co-op and also the more classic things that go to work. And that was really important because it gave us our own identity. It also, we took it from the men's. That we gave the value that we did in men's. We went to the same manufacturers that made Chanel and all the other lines. We had a design studio. The buyers just didn't do it. We went to great cashmere factories and shirting factories and lingerie factories and shoe factories. We had a great shoe business. And so we built up our own name, and it was commiserate with what their neighbors were doing, which were the designers, except they were maybe 20% or 30% cheaper and way more margin. No different than what the designers do by selling themselves, right? So we went uptown. We did a lot of business. We opened in LA. We did a lot of business. And we opened in Tokyo. And we did a lot of business. But at that time, we started closing Barneys America stores. Not all of them, but most of them.
Just to put a point here, it was, I think, just post the opening of Madison Avenue when you started to feel some of the financial pressure on the growth, on the expansion of the business.
First of all, the overruns in terms of construction were a lot.
When you say overruns, you noted in the book you spent maybe a little over $100 million for Barneys on Madison Avenue. I've heard it might be closer to $200 million. Somewhere in between may be the number, but it was a lot.
It was a lot. If I could have done it again, I think that the financial areas could have been managed better. You always need to have those guardrails, especially for the creative side. And, it's not rocket science, but they're not the financial areas, the accountants are not leading the way, but they're very important. They need to tell you to stay within your line. You could always tell them to fuck off, obviously, to a point, and probably should, but still to keep it manageable. There are things you can't predict. You can't predict sales, and you can't predict recessions. You definitely could control overruns in construction better. And by closing down a lot of the Barneys New York stores was a great move for many reasons. It wasn't just, we had sweetheart deals with the landlords. So it wasn't just about that. They didn't cost that much to build. It's just that they were a distraction. Because now Madison Avenue at its height was doing $380 million in one store annually. There are not many stores on the planet that could do that business with that kind of merchandise. American Express told me, and this is before Black Card, that Barneys was the #1 customer of Platinum in the country. So, second guess is, you could say what you want, but that machine was humming.
And to Gene, that we didn't touch on, I think something that Barneys, at least from my recollection, something that Barneys did/authored was creating store entertainment. You had a restaurant. You were big in the hospitality business. You put Radu's Gym with Cindy Crawford on the top floor when Barneys first opened. I mean, this was a place to experience, not just shop.
Yeah, the gym actually never opened. I wanted it to open. And it wasn't just a gym. It was a wellness thing. And in those days, wellness didn't exist. So, because we're always looking for new concepts, like when we started the cosmetic business, when we did women's, because you can't be in the women's business without cosmetics. We had a whole area called the apothecary, which was natural products, which never existed before. We were the first customer of Kiehl's. We brought Molton Browns to this country. We brought all kinds of products. That was Barneys DNA, right? We didn't sit on our laurels. We had to reinvent what already existed that would become very Barneys and also capture the imagination. So, yeah, we were pretty good at hospitality and food. Besides Fred's, we own Coco Pazzo in New York. We own La Madre in New York. We own Barney Greengrass in LA and several other restaurants, Piccolo Cucinas around the country. We had a very good partner in Pino Longo, who was a very good restaurateur. So I think, if we're going to go into something, which we talked about before, we had to do it the right way. It wasn't just a cafeteria in a department store, which a lot of these sort of restaurants are, that it had to stand on its own. I think that Fred's at its height did almost $15 million in business, and that was primarily lunch. You couldn't get in there, and Mark Straussman, who also still were very good friends, he's a great chef. So, if you're going to do something, you got to do it right, right? But going back to the other thing, yeah, it became Barneys for so many years either paid their bills on time or paid them early or even financed young designers because we were champions of young designers. We would give them money to buy fabric. We would give them, allowances to do all these things because we believed in them. But it started to get ugly when people were complaining that they weren't getting paid. And that was very tough also because the big guys, they didn't mess around. They had factors, they had things. And the little guys, you didn't want to hurt them, but there were some ugly decisions made at that time, which, who wants to be in that position? But yeah, we finally filed bankruptcy, and Barneys should never have been in bankruptcy, ever. It had the highest maintained markup of any store in the country. Okay, there was no reason. So, it could have been managed better. No question about it. I talk about it in the book. I raise my hand and take part blame.
Gene, let's wrap because there's so much here. And again, the book goes into the detail and the stories behind the stories. So fascinating. But If you could have Barney's and your role in it remembered for one thing, what would it be?
I think that it wasn't a store. It created culture. It became part of the culture. It was influenced by culture. We had the best customers in the world. I think we also had the best merchandise in the world. And I think Barney's sensibility was very unique. It was like 10% off. I'm not talking about discounts now. I'm talking about in terms of point of view. And it had that great sense of humor. It never took itself too seriously. What I was talking about before is that it was elite in terms of what its standards were, our product, but it wasn't elitist. I used to see young people walk in the store. If it was a young girl, she knew she couldn't afford very much, but she would go to the makeup counter and buy a lipstick and put it in her Barney's bag and go out and feel good about herself because she loved being at Barney's, it was special for her. So, no, I'm proud of the legacy that my family made. What amazes me is I hear so many young people today talk about Barney's in such reverence, and they'd never even been to Barney's. And that's like crazy. So it's great. And I felt it was the right time to write the book. So many stories were told about Barney's over the years. I mean, it wasn't like we didn't get press, both good and bad. And I just felt that a lot of it wasn't correct. So I wanted to correct the record. And I also wanted to explain that it wasn't just buying beautiful things. There was really a business behind it and a lot of thought. And Barney's was I hate the word influencer, but it was probably one of the greatest influencers ever.
I see Barney's as a brand because when I think about Barney's, kind of like the way you think about Ralph Lauren, you can see it, you can hear it, you can smell it, you can taste it, but it was an experience. It wasn't any one part of the store. It was the experience. And congratulations on building that.
Thank you.
I want to end with one quote because it caught me and maybe summarized for me your experience or the value that you added as a true merchant. And the quote is, analytics is a way of thinking big, get the most information, comb it for patterns, maximize your sales, minimize your risks. That misses the point completely. You have to take risks. You don't give the customers what they want. You give them what they don't know they want yet. End quote. And I think that is the job of a merchant. And so much of that has been replaced by the data and the availability of information that's out there today. The true gut and the selection of product just seems to have lost its way. And I go back to when you were running a business, or I had the good fortune of working for Mickey Drexler, different type of business we were running, but we still had to put a bet on what she or he was going to buy. And no data could tell us that.
Let's be honest. The fashion world is in trouble. Okay. I don't think that's a secret. And part of the problem is it's owned by like three people. And fashion business is not the only business to suffer that. You have the film and TV industry, you have the publishing industry, the art world, whatever in creative endeavor you can think about, they're all going through that. And it limits the opportunity for young, talented people. And it becomes very monolithic and boring. And so, because it's only about big business, it's the cart before the horse. There's no long-term thinking. It's what I can do today. And when you're really running sort of a theatrical store, if you will, or theater, it's about selling the dream and making customers feel good about what you're doing and about themselves. And I don't see how that's possible when all you're thinking about is products, because all you're doing is watering things down. We used to call them lost leaders. You have to have a certain amount of merchandise and other things in the store that maybe don't make the kind of profit or sell as fast as other things, but they create the fantasy and the image and the DNA. And it's that magic mix, that combination of the two, that makes it a special environment. And I really feel that's lacking. The one other thing I would say is blaming it on the internet is overrated. And the reason is it's twofold. One is that way before in the 90s, when the internet came to being, department stores were already writing their demise by starting to sell merchandise on sale and training the customer to only buy on sale. And once they did that, that was the kiss of death. And so besides looking like a sea of sameness where every designer boutique is built exactly the same in every store, it was also customers were only going on there to buy on sale. Their customers are not stupid. The other thing is this that I came to learn. The internet is another avenue or another store, if you will, to sell, but it's not the end all. In fact, most businesses online lose money. Okay, it is not a success story. In fact, some of the bigger companies that sell online, I'm not talking about manufacturers, I'm talking about just online sites, they lose money. And the margins are much shorter. Yeah, they don't have to own inventory, but purposely, because the wholesaler doesn't want to take the risk, they're going to give them much shorter margins. And I only came to learn about that in the last couple of years. I didn't even know about that. And young designers that have their own websites, it's very difficult for them to get traffic to come to their sites. So what do? They latch on to manufacturer sites. And by doing that, when the customer clicks on this designer site and it goes right to the manufacturer, it just becomes unedited sea of sameness again. So it's a bit of a quandary, right? Where the situation is right now. And then, like I said, you've got maybe 3 companies that control the whole industry, and it's difficult. So I think the future is going to be young people that are willing to be within their stores, give the kind of service, be in the back with their sewing machines, doing their own edits so it's their point of view, and having that personal attention and, their personality, whatever it is. And I think that's what's going to build businesses. That's my feeling on the subject.
And with that, we will land this flight of the Retail Pilot. Gene, thanks so much for joining us. And all listening, I encourage you to get Gene's memoir, They All Came to Barneys. Thanks for tuning in to this week's flight of the Retail Pilot. And please give us a review on your favorite podcast platform.